Hello everybody, this is TipTop MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, I am breaking down all of the spoilers that have come out today being April 5th, for Commander 2021 or Strixhaven Commander, however you want to think about it. So just note, while I have been covering Strixhaven spoilers for the past 2 weeks, these are for Commander, meaning they will only be legal in Eternal formats like Commander. So when you look at these cards, don't think about them in the terms of standard. Today they spoiled everything for the Lorehold deck. So we're going to look at all of the new cards that they spoiled for that, and then we're going to look at the deck list a little bit at the end. This video will not be my review of the deck. That will come at a later point. So this is kind of like my first reaction to all of these cards. Let's jump right into this. Before actually jumping into this, I want to say I've been really excited about what Lorehold has been doing in the main set, and the Commander, which we're going to talk about here really quickly, for this deck looks pretty awesome. It's one of my favorites of the Commanders. So I'm excited to see where this goes. Either way, let's actually jump into this. So this was spoiled a little bit back, but Audacious the Reconstructor is the face commander for this Commander deck. It's a 4-cost, red and white, 4/4 legendary creature, giant artificer with vigilance. And you can pay 1 and sacrifice an artifact to give target creature you control +2/+0 until end of turn. And you can do this at instant speed, but that's not really why he's cool. He's cool because you can pay X and tap and exile a card, or an artifact card, with mana value X from your graveyard, and create 2 tokens that are copies of the exiled card, but you can only do that at instant speed. At sorcery speed. And so yeah, he's really awesome. He is a Boros colored commander that isn't super focused around combat, and that's not something we get all of the time, so it's really awesome. He does of course have a little bit of that with the, gets +2/+0, but it really is focused more on that bottom ability. He's kind of a self-contained engine even because of that sacrifice outlet. So yeah, he's pretty awesome. So let's jump into the rest of the cards. So keep in mind that the rest of these cards are going to be played, at least in the pre-con, with Audacious as the lead. Or you can also use this commander as the lead. Let's talk about it. It's a 5-cost red and white legendary artifact creature golem 4/5, and it says other artifact creatures you control have haste. So that's interesting. I don't know necessarily how good that is. It is leaning more into the Boros likes to attack part, and then it says whenever 1 or more artifact creatures you control attack, so we're kind of going more into the Boros likes to attack. It deals X damage to any target, and you scry X, where X is the number of tapped artifacts you control. So while this is a lot more combat heavy compared to Audacious, it still has some very interesting aspects to it. For instance, yes, your artifact creatures have haste, but that doesn't mean you're attacking with them. That could mean you're activating their abilities. There are a couple artifact creatures that tap for mana, and part of the reason they're balanced as such is that they don't enter with haste. You can't tap them the turn they come down, but you can with this out. In addition, yes, you might be thinking, oh, whenever you attack with artifact creatures, you're going to be dealing damage equal to the number of them that are attacking, but that's not what it says. It says the number of tapped artifacts you control. So that includes things like mana rocks, or really anything that you can tap. So it's really interesting in my opinion, just because, yes, you can go with the Boros, I'm going to attack with everything, but you can also go, with a little bit more of a, I'm going to swing with one thing and get this massive, damage trigger that is done by me tapping down a bunch of other artifacts for other reasons. So I think it's really cool. Next, we have Lorehold Clockwork Scholar. So this is now a mono white legendary creature, elephant artificer, 3-cost, 2/4. It says prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to attacking artifact creatures you control. So again, we're going more into that Boros and mono white liking to attack, but whenever 1 or more artifact creatures enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So generally, white doesn't necessarily get card draw unless one of 2 things are happening. 1, you're behind your opponent in card draw, and actually there's 3 things, and that's pretty rare that happens. 2, not that you're behind, that they get effects like that. 2, you are also giving your opponent's card draw, so we got Secret Rendezvous in this set, and it makes you and an opponent draw 3 cards. Or when your opponent does something to you. So, for instance, the Wolf Mila on Luca, it says whenever a permanent you control is targeted by a spell or ability, you draw a card. So it's your opponents are pretty much in control of your draw. If, yeah. That's kind of the idea. Normally, your opponents are in control of whether you can draw or not, whether by getting ahead of you or by doing something that you say no to. However, very rarely we will get effects that just let you draw a card. For instance, Shram from Aether Revolt, I believe it is, lets you draw a card whenever you cast a vehicle, equipment, or aura, and that's very out of place. Now, this is slightly less powerful than that, just because this only triggers once each turn, but it is really awesome to see white get a little bit of card draw for something that is so niche, because, you know, artifact creatures, it's not like there's none of them, but there aren't a ton. And so it is one of those things where it's similar to like equipment and auras and stuff like that. So I think it's very shrammy in nature. And I think this will be one of the more popular mono white commanders just because it says draw a card on there. Similarly to card advantage, Layla, the Blade Reforged, is a 3-cost red legendary creature spirit warrior 2/2 with haste, and whenever it attacks, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So it's impulsive draw. We see red do this a ton. And then it says whenever you exile one or more cards from your library and or graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Layla. So it's very interesting because, yes, you're thinking, okay, so every turn you draw an extra card that you can only cast that turn, and Layla gets bigger. Which it looks pretty good because, yes, you have to attack to get that trigger, but she's also getting bigger, so she can kind of keep up with the later game threats because she is getting bigger. But I think where this card will be really awesome is combined with more impulsive draw, graveyard exiling effects, stuff like that. So like, Underworld Breach, cards that take cards from your graveyard and exile them maybe as an additional cost, or cards that exile the top card of your library. Note that things like Flashback don't work with this because you are casting it and then as it resolves, you're exiling it. So you're not exiling it from your graveyard and then casting a copy. You're casting the same card, but then it gets exiled. So it's not technically in your graveyard when that happens. So there are a couple things that don't necessarily work that you might have jumped to. However, I think there are a lot of interesting cards that deal with exiling. So I really think she's interesting not for that attack clause, but for the whenever you exile something clause. But then again, you are just getting counters. So, you know, is it worth jumping through all these hoops when you have spells that can do something like that? In my opinion, this is one of the least interesting legendaries, but I still think it's a really awesome direction that can lead to interesting gameplay. So I don't think any of these legendaries are boring. Next, we have Excavation Technique, our first non-legendary. It is a 4-cost white sorcery with Demonstrate, which is a new mechanic that says whenever you cast a spell, you may copy it. If you do, choose an opponent to also copy it. Players may choose new targets for their copies. So essentially, you cast this, and you have the option. You can just cast this and ignore Demonstrate, or you can get a copy of it, meaning now you have 2 copies of this card, and then you give an opponent 1 copy. So you get 2 copies, and an opponent gets 1. So in a 1v1, it's not that great. But in a 1v1v1v1, you can say, hey, how about you not target my stuff, and I'll give you a removal spell that you can point at anything that's not my stuff. Now, you're spending 4 mana to get rid of 3 permanents that are not yours. Now, I didn't actually explain what the card does. It destroys target non-land permanent. Its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. So you can essentially, for 4 mana, destroy 3 things, especially if there is someone who is like ahead in the game. You can kind of team up with someone. It often happens where someone becomes the archenemy. This is a card that promotes, you know, forming an alliance with people to take down the archenemy. Similarly, it can also be a white ramp spell. Let's say you have, I don't know, some permanent you don't need, a 1/1 soldier that was created off of some white card somewhere. You can destroy that with this. You can target it yourself and create 2 treasure tokens, which means the next turn you'll be 2 mana ahead. So this is a removal spell, taking down an archenemy spell, and it's a ramp spell. So it kind of makes you friends, ramps you, it can be removal, it can do a lot. The one thing it's not good at is destroying commanders, because say they have a 7-cost commander, you destroy it, you're like, haha, your commander costs 9. Well, you just gave them the 2 treasures to replace it. So it doesn't feel good to take out their commander, but it can do that. For instance, if you need to slow them down, if maybe their commander has counters on it, or if their commander has like a tap ability and you just need to slow them down 1 turn. But yeah, it doesn't feel great to go against commanders. Next, we have Cursed Mirror. It's a 3-cost red artifact. You can tap to add red, so it's a mana rock, and then as it enters the battlefield, you may have it become a copy of any creature on the battlefield until end of turn, except it has haste. One thing to note here, if you play this and have it become a copy of a creature, it loses its ability to tap for mana for that turn. So it's not like you are paying 3, getting a copy of a creature, and you can tap that creature for mana. No, it doesn't say, and it keeps its other abilities. So the turn you play this, if you're playing it as a creature, which it can be a creature on the end, on your opponent's side of the battlefield. It is becoming that creature and you're not getting to tap it, because there will be times where you want to just pay 3 mana for a mana rock. That leaves you with like 1 untapped mana plus the 1 from the mana rock to let you cast something else. And so be careful that you don't make that mistake. However, I do think this is a really, really interesting card, and honestly, a lot of decks are probably going to run it. I mean, you're probably not running 3 mana rocks in a mono red deck, but if you are, this is a pretty good replacement for anything. If your mana rocks are there purely to ramp you and not to color fix you, this just seems like a really good inclusion, and it's a way for red to gain some value. Next, we have Monologue Tax. It's a 3-cost white enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, you create a treasure token. So it's kind of like a budget Smothering Tithe. Smothering Tithe costs 4, and whenever an opponent draws a card, they can pay 2. If they don't, you create a treasure. So technically, this can be better if your opponents are constantly paying 2. But then again, if your opponents are paying 2 more to draw every single card, then Smothering Tithe becomes even better, just because it says, drawing a card costs your opponents 2 mana. Now this, it's a lot rarer for people to cast 2 spells on a turn than they draw a card, because they draw a card every turn. So definitely less good, but it is still mono white ramp, and I can see a lot of decks running both. It really promotes, not casting lots of spells on a turn. Now, this does not say for their second spell and beyond. So for their first spell, you don't get a treasure. For their second spell, you do get a treasure. For their third spell, you don't get a treasure. So you're getting at max 1 treasure per turn cycle. And that's not actually true. I mean, if your opponent casts a spell and then they cast their second spell, and then some other opponent counterspells the spell, and then, the first opponent counterspells the counterspell, then they counterspell the, if an opponent whose turn it's not cast 2 spells, you also get a treasure, even if the person whose turn it is cast 2 spells. So you can get more than 1, but typically you're going to get at most probably 4 around the table, or 3. So yeah, not nearly as good as Smothering Tithe, but still pretty awesome. Next, we have Battle Mage's Bracers. It's a 3-cost red artifact equipment. Equipped creature has haste, and then whenever an ability of the equipped creature is activated, if it isn't a mana ability, you may pay 1 generic mana. If you do copy that ability, you may choose new targets for the copy and equip 2. So this is a kind of homage, or very similar to Illusionist Bracer, that does kind of the same effect, but you don't have to pay mana for it, and it costs 2 instead of 3, and it's colorless. So you might be thinking, oh, that card's just better, why would you ever want this? 2 things. First off, having 2 copies of it in your deck, pretty good. Second thing, this gives haste, which might not sound like a really big deal, but think about it like this. A lot of the time, this effect is played in a pinger deck, and what I mean by pinger deck is you have a commander or some card that can tap to deal 1 damage to something. Well, if you can double that, now you're dealing 2 damage, and especially if you can give it Death Touch. So if you give a pinger Death Touch, and now you can start doubling it, means you can tap it once to kill 2 things. Now here's the thing, if you're tapping it, you can't do that the turn it comes out. So Battle Mage's Bracer not only lets you double the counter, but it lets you use the abilities the turn they come out. So I really don't see the haste being there specifically for attacking, although they can do that. I see it being there as, oh, I play this, and then I can immediately, activate the tap ability, which you're going to want to do and duplicate. So I think it's actually really, really awesome in that way, where it is, slightly worse than Illusionist Bracers in some way and slightly better in others. And I think that's how cards should be designed. If we just keep getting cards that are purely better than older cards, eventually the format is going to literally be only new cards. So the fact that this is better in some decks and worse in others than Illusionist Bracer is really awesome. Next, we have Archaeomancer's Map. It's a 3-cost white artifact. When it ETBs, search your library for up to 2 basic plains cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand. So when it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards. Pretty good. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player controls more lands than you, you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. So this is a white version of a card that I can't remember in green. It's a 1-drop enchantment. Whenever an opponent plays a land, you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield, but you have to be behind them. So the idea is if you're playing against like a mega ramp deck, you play this for 3, maybe after you dropped your 3rd land, your opponent maybe ramps and puts 2 lands down, boom, you just ramped 2. So it kind of keeps you, with your opponents. Of course, the big deal here is that you do need to have the lands in your hand, which means you need to draw cards, which white doesn't necessarily get to do, but this card is a major step. Like, at its worst, this is kind of like a slightly worse version of Cultivate, but it's also an artifact that sticks around and can maybe get you some surprise value later. I mean, think about it like this. someone makes you draw on their turn. I don't know, maybe they wield or something. Now your opponent plays a land, and now just randomly, even though you didn't have a land in your hand during your turn, you can drop it down. So it's this persistent effect that may not be super threatening, so it's not really going to get removed, but it can kind of bring value later on. So I think it's really, really interesting for that reason, and we'll see play in a lot of white decks that don't have access to green, and maybe even white decks that do have access to green. I mean, that's not a bad effect. Next, we have Rune Grinder. It's a 6-cost red artifact creature construct, 7/4, so a 7/4 for 6, with Menace, and when it dies, each player may discard their hand and draw 7. Now, the may here does make it a lot worse. I mean, if you want to refill your hand, that's great. Now, sometimes what a wheel's really good for is, oh, you bounce something back to their hand, or someone bounced something back to someone's hand, oh, let's wheel now. But if your opponents like their hand, they're not going to do it. On the other side, if your opponent is kind of greedy and likes one card in their hand and decides not to wheel, you're not taking everyone up to 7 cards, which means it can be both a good and a bad thing. However, it also has mountain cycling too, meaning you can discard the card for 2 from your hand and search your library for a mountain card and put it into your hand. It doesn't have to be a basic, so you can go get your bad land if you're, playing with real expensive lands, or your shock lands, or whatever you want to go get, maybe a Triome, and you can kind of just put that right into your hand. I actually think this card is really, really good. I mean, would you play a 2-cost spell that says, go get a mountain from your library and put it into your hand? Probably not, but the fact that if you draw this early game, it color fixes you. If you draw this late game, it's a threat. I mean, think about if you replaced this with something that color fixes you. All right, you draw it early game, that's amazing. But if you draw it late game, that kind of sucks. So this can kind of play as that color fixer in the beginning and play as a finisher of sorts towards the end. And then on top of that, it has mountain cycling, meaning you can discard it into your graveyard, which, by the way, this deck wants to put things in its graveyard to recur them. So yes, lots of value for that. Similarly, not this card, but a card coming up we'll talk about. Either way, this is Bronze Guardian. It's a 5-cost white artifact creature golem, star 5, with double strike and ward 2, meaning you have to pay 2 to target it. It's not exactly how it works when it becomes targeted with a spell or ability. Counter that spell or ability unless its controller pays 2. And then it gives other artifacts you control ward. Pretty awesome. I could see this maybe going into an artifact and equipment deck, just because, this is a double striker. It's harder to target, meaning you feel more comfortable equipping your equipment to it, and it's harder for them to blow up your equipment itself. And then its power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. So if you equip this with 3, even just basic equipment that give +1/+1, then, for each equipment, so it would have 6 power. It's a double striker. All of your equipment's harder to hit, and it's harder to hit. This is really good, and I think it'll see play in artifact, and more specifically, equipment decks. However, I could also see it being played just in a generic artifact deck to make all your artifacts harder to target. Because honestly, if I have an artifact removal spell and I can remove your artifact for 3 mana or your artifact for 5, in Commander, Ward can be extra powerful because, yeah, I have a spell, destroy target non-land permanent. I can destroy your artifact for 5 mana, or I can destroy your creature for 3. I think I'll go for the 3. Now, that might not always happen, but it is definitely a good incentive. Next, we have Audacious Reshapers. It is a 3-cost, there's a lot of 3-cost, red creature, human artificer, 3/3. You can tap and sack a creature to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. It deals damage equal to the number of cards revealed this way to you. So you're going to kind of sack your treasure token or something you created that you don't want anymore and turn it into something else. This can go from a treasure token to a Blightsteel Colossus, or from a treasure token to a Soul Ring. It really just depends on what you run into. And you really can't use this as a combo-y thing unless you're trying to kill yourself with it, just because you are in a 100-card deck. And so, you can't rely on having one other card in your deck and comboing into that. So, yeah, this seems like something that is really just there for the fun chaosiness of it. I think you need to be running a decent amount of artifacts to not kill yourself by accident. But yeah, pretty good. The fact that you can turn some little thing into a humongous, ginormous threat. There are a lot of expensive artifacts. It's a pretty good card. Next, we have Digsite Engineer. It's a 3-cost, again, white creature dwarf artificer, 3/3, and whenever you cast an artifact spell, you may pay 2. If you do, create a 0/0 colorless contract artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Alright, this is pretty crazy. In a deck that cares about artifacts, which you kind of need for that first ability to pay off, you can get 2 artifacts every time you cast 1 if you pay 2 more. But not only that, it's not just some generic token artifact that does nothing else. It's going to be a huge creature that keeps getting bigger. It's at least a 2/2 because you cast an artifact spell and you get the creature, unless one of them gets countered, and so it can provide a lot of extra value. Artifacts often care about the number of artifacts you control, and so having all your artifacts enter like twice, essentially, is pretty good. So I think this will be a pretty good card in white artifact decks, and like white mixed artifact decks. Next, we have Angel of the Runes. This is the counterpart to the Mountain Cycling card we saw earlier. It's a 7-cost 5/7 with flying, and when it ETBs, exile up to 2 target artifacts and or enchantments. So get rid of 2 things when it ETBs, and then Plane Cycling for 2. Again, pretty much everything I said for the previous one applies here. If you draw it early game, great, you fix your lands, and if you draw it late game, it's nice. You get to destroy some of your opponent's stuff, get a big flying creature, pretty good. Next, we have Wake the Past. It's a 7-cost red and white sorcery, and it says return all artifact cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, no matter what their cost is. So if you have a Blightsteel Colossus, it's coming down. And they gain haste until end of turn, so it's coming down and swinging. Of course, this is a 7-drop, so it's definitely appropriate in power. It's kind of a replenish for artifacts, where replenish is like a 4-cost sorcery that returns all enchantments from your graveyard to the battlefield. Of course, this is a lot more expensive, but it does do that hasty thing, which is pretty interesting. It feels a little more gimmicky than some of the other ones, but in a self-mill artifact deck, which Lorehold seems to like to discard things and sacrifice things, it could be pretty interesting. And a pretty good finisher. Next, we have Studyhole. I would not be surprised if this is in every single one of the commander decks, because it's nothing specific to Lorehold here. You can tap to add colorless, and then you can pay 1 and tap and add 1 mana of any color, so you're technically not gaining a mana from Studyhole here. But if you do, you scry X when you cast your commander, where X is the number of times it's been cast from the command zone. So if you spend that mana, to cast your commander, you scry X, where X is the number of time that your commander has been cast. So if you have a cheap commander, it is very specific to that commander, I believe. Yeah, so if you, for instance, are running partners and you have the little 0-drop commander, and then you cast the 7-drop, well, you've only cast that 7-drop once. So it is pretty interesting. I don't love it, although it can help with mana fixing. So maybe it has a little bit of room, but I just don't love the card. Next, we have Triplicate Titan. It's a 9-cost artifact creature golem 9/9. If you're wondering why some of these are so expensive, it is because Boros, this deck, is wanting to like recur things out of the graveyard, and so you want to get expensive stuff in there. So it has Flying, Vigilance, and Trample. All right, so 9/9, Flying, Vigilance, Trample, that's pretty good. And when it dies, create a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token with Flying, a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token with Vigilance, and a 3/3 golem with Trample. Okay, so here's what this is. This is, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name. The Big Snake. I feel so dumb right now. Wormcoil Engine, sorry. Wormcoil Engine's like a 6/6 or something, and when it dies, 6/6 with lifelink and death touch. When it dies, you get a 3/3 with lifelink and a 3/3 with death touch. This is that, but with Vigilance, Flying, and Trample. So it's very interesting. It's something that you want to cheat into play, and then if it dies or if you sacrifice it, you're getting a ton of value. Maybe you sacrifice it to then bring it back, and then do some crazy stuff with that. Maybe you had 2 token copies of it from your commander, and then you sacrifice those, and then you get like a ton of 3/3s. Really awesome in my opinion, and it feels like a card that this deck really wants to have. Alright guys, that is it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button. I'll be covering these all throughout the week as they reveal all of the decks, so hit that subscribe button to stay up to date. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.